Hi friends, okay, I really wanted to film an intro for this video, but things have been really hectic at my full-time job and I wanted to get this video out to you this week, so let's jump right in. If you've been following along on social media, you will know that I have been obsessed with making resin ocean serving trays. I've been making them for art shows this year and giving them as gifts to friends and family. I just can't get enough of making them, and since I've been sharing them a lot, I've been getting a lot of questions about my process and how I make them, so I decided to finally make a video. Now, to get started on this custom serving tray, I decided to use a piece of scrap wood that I had laying around. This piece was a really awesome live edge piece that's just a little too small to do anything substantial with, and I decided to cut it down to a size that I was really happy with to get started. When designing the serving tray, I decided that I wanted to add a small opening for hanging the serving tray when not in use, and I decided to do this by using a Forstner bit and my drill. Last time I made a serving tray just like this one on my channel, I did use a drill press, but a lot of people said they didn't have a drill press, so I wanted to show that it can also be done just using a regular drill. A fun little tip here, if you're ever using a Forstner bit and you press it all the way through the wood, you're going to get some blowout on the other end. So to avoid doing this, I usually drill almost all the way through until the tip of the Forstner bit pokes through the other side. I then flip the board over and then I use the Forstner bit on the other side of the wood to finish the hole. Now, if you haven't noticed from watching my channel, I'm kind of a sucker for live edge wood projects, so I did decide to keep one of the live edges intact on this piece of wood that I cut into my serving tray. The live edge on this piece, however, did need a little bit of love, so I used my chisel and my sander in order to remove the bulk of the bark from the live edge. And once the bulk of the bark was removed, I also decided to do a preliminary step of sanding here to about 120 grit to perfectly smooth out the wood to prep it for the resin pour. This also included rounding out the edges a little bit with the sander to break that really hard edge so that when I pour the resin later, there's more room for me to be able to gradually sand it and transition it into the wood. I also made sure to hand sand the small opening for the handle, but it didn't need to be perfect because a lot of the resin will fill in some of that blowout and some of the pores later. And once the board was pretty much finished, it was time to prep for my resin pour. Because I'm legitimately obsessed with pouring oceans right now, I do have a bucket that I keep around with all of the essential tools that I need for my pours, and you can find the full list of these materials and products that I use on my website by clicking on the link below this video. Other thing to mention is that right now in New York it is pretty cold, so I do have to pour inside in a well-ventilated room, and that's why keeping all of my stuff in a bucket is really helpful.
I feel like if someone saw this bucket out of context, they would be very concerned about what I was doing.
Before getting excited and pouring the resin, there was one more thing I had to do to prep this serving tray, and this is a trick that I used when I poured the ocean on my friend Tamar's guitar. I basically just get started by using painter's tape to cover any of the areas that I don't want covered in the resin. The resin is going to pour down the edges of this board, and I want a nice clean edge, and it's also going to pool on the bottom of the board, so I make sure to tuck the tape underneath the board as well. But once that board was sealed, it was time to elevate it on some plastic cups and get started with the resin pour. So let's talk resin. There are so many amazing options on the market right now, but my go-to for my ocean pours has been Moss Tabletop Epoxy. It's honestly super easy to measure and mix. It's a 1-to-1 ratio, so you put 1 part hardener to 1 part resin, and then you pour it in a bigger container and mix it up for about 3 minutes by hand, and you're good to go. Now, I know that epoxy resin can get kind of pricey, but you actually don't need that much for an ocean pour. In fact, I poured about 3 times more than I needed for this project because I was experimenting with something else while pouring this ocean. You don't need to use this much resin when you pour. You can play around with the ratios, figure out what works for you. This is just something that I did because I was working on a couple things at once. But okay, so once I was done mixing up the resin, I then distributed it into different cups, and I'm going to be using a dark pigment, medium pigment, light pigment, clear, and a white pigment as well, so I needed 5 cups in total. And to just salvage and recycle the container I was using, I ended up using that for the clear epoxy, and I used the smaller cups to mix up the pigments. I'm really lucky that I got to learn a lot about these techniques from the best of the best, and I have linked those amazing artists below this video for you to check out as well. But one of the things I have learned over the past 6-7 months of doing this on my own is that there are certain pigments that I prefer to use. To be more specific, I do prefer fluid acrylics for a lot of my blue hues, a regular acrylic paint for my light blue, and a mix-all white for my white, but I've linked to all of those things on my website in my materials list so that you can check them out on your own. But basically, as you can see, I kind of mixed different color combos into different cups until I was happy with my dark, medium, and light blue, and then my white pigment as well. And actually that light blue I ended up hating, and I added some more blue to it later, but once I was happy, it was time to pour. When starting with the pour, I always like to start with the darkest color first, and I add this color in a really organic way. I don't think about it too much. I kind of just pour it all over the slab until I think it looks good. And once I'm happy with that, I then move on to the medium color and then the light color as well. One thing I do want to mention, and probably should have mentioned earlier in this video, is that if you don't want to make a custom cutting board, you can get a pre-made cutting board from a store and pour onto that as well, and it works just as beautifully. But anyway, back to the tutorial. Once I poured those 3 blue colors, I then just use a popsicle stick to kind of blend them together a little bit to get rid of those harsh seams. I then used my heat gun on the high heat setting to blend the colors together even more. I was also really careful here to not hover the heat gun over the resin in one spot for too long because that can cause the resin to burn or bubble, and that's really hard to fix later. And once I was happy with how the colors blended, I then added a little row of clear epoxy, and once that clear epoxy was down, I then added my white epoxy next to it. There really is no magic formula here. I kind of just added the white epoxy until I was happy with what I was seeing. I then revisited my heat gun and put it on high heat and began to blow the white epoxy into the other epoxies that I had already laid down on the serving tray. And something to mention that's kind of cool, after you apply the heat to the white pigment, it does lace and make these really cool wave formations by itself, so I kind of let it sit and do its thing for a little bit after applying the heat. And the next step is just a personal preference thing, but I decided to add another layer of white epoxy to make it look like a thicker wave. And once I was happy with the way it looked, I did a quick pass using my small butane torch to pop any bubbles and also add a little more heat to the resin. I also use this time to get obsessive about picking out these little specks out of the resin, but this is the perfect time to do it before it starts to harden. I also took this time to use a paintbrush to coat any of the areas that didn't get covered with resin with epoxy resin before everything hardened. I then let the piece sit for about 4 to 5 hours before repeating the same exact steps again on a second layer. I'll be honest, I really love that first layer and I didn't want to do a second layer, but I actually decided to do the second layer just for demonstration purposes for this video. The coloring was kind of off on the second layer. I should have done a better job of matching the colors, but all in all, I think it worked out okay in the end. One thing I do want to note is that since I learned how to do this technique last summer, I have been making tons and tons of boards. This is probably about my 50th board that I've made, and not all 50 of them turned out this nice. So even though I'm showing this tutorial and giving a lot of advice, my best advice really is just be patient with the process and know that you're going to make a couple of mistakes here and there until you're happy with your own process. In the end, your process may not look like mine, you may not use the same pigments or the same tools, but you will find something that works for you and it's going to be worth it. Now, enough motivational speaking, back to the project. After I was out my second pour, I let the board dry overnight, and then I came back to the board and used my heat gun to heat up the tape and pulled that tape away from the board. And basically what this does is it makes removing the tape from the resin a lot easier, and it also leaves a nice clean line. Now on my board, there were some spots where the epoxy resin did seep underneath the tape, but no big deal, because after I pulled the tape off, I then brought the board into my workshop and used my sander with about 120 grit sandpaper to gently remove that excess resin. And once I was happy with the resin removal, I then sanded the entire board to 320 grit, used some water to wet the grain and to raise the grain, and what this is going to do is it's going to prevent the board from getting that hairy, gross feeling when I wash it the first time. And after that dried, I then sanded it back down to 400 grit and then applied my favorite cutting board oil. When making projects that I know are going to be touching food, I always use a food safe finish. And I do get this question a lot, but epoxy resin is actually okay to put food on once it is fully cured, but it is not really safe to cut into because chunks of resin could come off and end up in your food. So that's why I'm calling this project a serving tray and not a cutting board. Anyway, once it was dry and I let everything cure, it was then time to bring the serving board inside and enjoy it. I'm genuinely not kidding when I say I've made about 50 of these things. I love making ocean serving trays. They are easily my favorite project for the weekend, and as a weekend warrior, I appreciate a really good project that you can finish in just a couple of days of work. Even better, these things make awesome gifts, and I know that holiday season just passed, so this is very poor timing on my part, but if you're looking for someone to give a gift to, or you're looking for a creative gift idea, this is an excellent one. In any event, if you're one of the many people who asked for this tutorial, I do hope that it was helpful, and if you didn't ask for this tutorial, I still hope that it was helpful. Either way, I do hope that you enjoyed this video. Thanks so much, you guys, for watching. Please make sure to subscribe for more projects in the future, and until next time, friends, happy DIYing.